The Denver Broncos got some great news ahead of the start of training camp. Could Javonte Williams, Tim Patrick be ready to go? All signs point forward as the Broncos also made 4 roster moves to place players on injured designation. We'll dive deep into that, how it impacts other positions on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, Broncos Country? Welcome into a brand new episode, Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much to everybody in Broncos Country for tuning in, making us your first listen of the day every single day. Make sure you subscribe for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Locked on Broncos is available for you every single day, all year long. Today's episode is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, Broncos reporter from Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by my co-host, my good friend, Sayre Bedinger. He's the site expert over there, predominantlyorange.com. Sayre, the Broncos announced several roster moves ahead of the start of training camp on Sunday, more so pertaining to players who were injured. There were some questions about their status coming into training camp. We got some answers on some of those players, but it also gave us, I think, a little bit more insight into maybe the readiness for some players we had concerns about coming into training camp. And I think first and foremost, all signs appear going forward here that Tim Patrick, Javonte Williams are going to be ready for the start of training camp, which is big news for the Broncos.
Couple of really big pieces of really good news for Broncos fans as we get into training camp. Of course, Javonte Williams probably being the most notable among the names that was kind of all stuck together amongst this group of players that hit the transaction wire on Sunday, Cody. But Javonte, of course, suffered that injury against the Las Vegas Raiders last year, hurt his knee, and there was initial fear that it could be a very, very severe, serious injury. But obviously, he's made it back in what feels like record time, right? I mean, it's crazy. We heard of him practicing in a limited, and you saw him practicing in a limited fashion at OTAs, and kind of, Sean Payton wasn't necessarily coy about it or anything. He was just kind of optimistic throughout the process. And I think you and I both faced quite a bit of pushback just reporting or relaying what even Sean Payton was saying about Javonte Williams at the time. We're saying, hey, Sean Payton said this. A lot of people on Twitter and jumping even into the comments are saying there's no way this is happening. Well, here we go. Javonte Williams not even going to carry an injury designation going into training camp. No PUP, no nothing. He's going to be a full go to start training camp. We'll see what that means in terms of his workload. But obviously, this is massive, massive news.
I mean, it's probably the biggest news you could get because obviously veterans, they'll report on Tuesday, July 25th. We all know training camp officially starts on July 28th. Friday will be open to everybody in Broncos country if you have a ticket through Ticketmaster. But, I mean, this is, I think, what people wanted to see. There was some concern initially going back to what Payton had said is, hey, we expect him to be ready for the start of training camp. And the whole question was really surrounding, is he going to start training camp on the PUP list, right? The physically unable to perform list. Well, the Broncos, they placed 2 players on Sunday on the PUP list. They also placed 2 players on the NFI list. So speaking of starters placed on either the NFI or the PUP list, I think you have to take a look at it. Like Tim Patrick, not on this list as well, which is great news. We combine him and Javonte together, 2 guys coming off of ACLs, not starting off on this list. That is tremendous news for them. But in terms of the PUP list, in terms of the NFI list, the Broncos, they have a starter that is going on the PUP list. They have a starter that's going on the NFI list. Now, in terms of PUP, Baron Browning, as we all know, outside linebacker here for the Broncos. We know he had a surgery on his knee during the offseason to repair a torn meniscus. He's been attacking rehab very aggressively. If you've caught him on social media, he's posted some updates for it. He's doing some things that are relatively well, but even Sean Payton himself said during mandatory minicamp, Barron will be on the PUP list to start the season. And I don't know if he meant to start the season as the regular season or if he meant the start of the season, which is training camp, he'll start on the PUP list. Either way, Baron Browning not going to be ready to go for Friday's festivities. And then obviously on the NFI list, the non-football injury list, You have Mike Purcell, who was placed there. And I think it's important to maybe highlight this. What does the NFI list designation even mean? It means that they suffered a non-football injury-related thing. Now, for Purcell, he didn't necessarily suffer an injury. He just had an off-season procedure. I'm not sure exactly what he had it on yet, whether it was a lower body extremity. That information is not out there, but he was in attendance at OTAs and mandatory minicamp. He was not able to physically participate, but he was there. He was observing. He was getting mental reps. I think it's important to highlight that. Obviously, we didn't see Barron at all during any of those things, and there was a lot of uncertainty, like, hey, where's Barron? Like, we haven't seen Barron at all in any of these practices. Come to find out, he did have the surgery, which was odd because I did a sit-down with him really a couple of weeks before all that, and for a photo shoot for Mile High Sports Magazine. We'll share all the preview stuff with you in the story we did with Barron, but it was a little interesting. You had no inclination. There was nothing on the radar that, he was dealing with anything. But then he also just recently signed to a new agency as well. So it really a busy offseason for Barron. But your thoughts here, Sayre, on Barron going on the PUP list. Can you give fans any insight into what this means for him during training camp versus what the PUP list may be like in the regular season?
Right. Obviously, when guys go on the PUP list during the regular season, it becomes a bit of a bigger issue, when you talk about how long they have to be out and things like that. The good news is that nobody's going on injured reserve right now. Nobody's obviously getting shut down for the entire season at this point. And I think part of what it is with Baron Browning is it's a really good thing that, we're not being surprised by this at this point. This is obviously in the team's plans, and you want to be able to see him come back. But typically guys have had to miss at least 6 games, Cody, when they go on the PUP to start the season. So if that is the case, these guys can come off at any point, by the way. So any of the players that we even mentioned that are going on any of these injury lists, yes, they do count against the team's 90-man roster. And yes, they can come off at any point. But once they come off, they can't go back on that same list, right? So that's why you put them on early on. You get them in this list right away, because you don't want to have to get into a situation where you're shutting them down before you make your 53-man roster or things like that. You want to have the best roster flexibility possible, and this gives you that opportunity to say, hey, if we try to bring him back and we don't put him on the PUP to start camp, we can't put him back on. So I think it's good planning by the Broncos. It's just being wise with your assets, and it's being wise with a guy like Browning, who has had some injury issues in his career, and you want to see him stay healthy. He's such a critical part of the Broncos pass rush going forward. You don't want him to be rushing back to the field. That's why you brought in Frank Clark. That's why we're excited about Jonathan Cooper. Nick Bonito's got to step up. There's guys that will step up in his absence. You want to make sure you play this thing as safe as possible, because he is a critical piece, and he knows it, right? He knows he had a good year last year. That's why you make the change in your agency, because you're getting to that point now where extension talks at least maybe next offseason, those things, they can start to kind of happen. So he's in for a big year this year. It's 17 regular season games, right? So there's no need to rush him back, but I think it's playing it safe for all parties involved.
Contingency plans we've already seen put in place, as you mentioned, with Frank Clark, Jonathan Cooper, other guys in that mix there. Now, if this were a move or none of those moves happen, I think if we got the news today that, okay, hey, Barron's going on the PUP list, then I think we'd be doing an episode saying, okay, well, who are the Broncos going to go out and sign at this point? Luckily, that's not the conversation we're having here. The Broncos also have 2 other players, key role players, rotational guys. 1 player placed on the PUP list, 1 player placed on the NFI list. We'll dive deep into that and tell you about who it is and what it means for those positions specifically. You'll get that on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. This episode of the show is brought to you by our friends over there at LinkedIn Jobs. And these days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. You want to be 100% certain that you have access to the best qualified candidates that are available on the market. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps find the right people for your team faster and for free. If you or your small business are hiring, it just takes minutes at LinkedIn Jobs to create a job post, and then you can get word out that you're hiring. Then you'll add your job, the purple hashtag hiring frame, to your LinkedIn profile to let others know that you and your company are looking to make a hire. They have simple tools like screening questions that make it easy to focus on candidates with just the right skills and experience, so you can quickly prioritize who you'd like to interview and who you'd like to hire. Make sure you continue the 2023 work year with the right team members in place with LinkedIn Jobs. It's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnfl to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply.
Well, we talked about some good injury news up front, but there is unfortunately some bad news to go along with it. Some guys that may not necessarily be full-time starters for the Denver Broncos, but certainly key role players going into the season, starting off on one injury list or another. Before we get into that, though, from Cody and I, we just want to say thank you to all of you. A huge mile-high salute to everybody out there that makes Locked On Broncos their first listen of the day every single day, wherever you listen to podcasts, free and available on all platforms. And of course, on YouTube as well. You can watch us over there. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, by the way. And kudos to you, pats on the back, for helping us get to 10,000 subscribers. We couldn't do it without you. We love, absolutely, and appreciate every single one of you for helping us get there. We're all part of this, and we're all in this together. And we've gotten through the dog days of the football offseason, but I think we had some fun along the way, Cody. Absolutely. And it's because of all of you who listen and watch. So thank you so much for doing so. And now we got to talk about some of the unfortunate news, right? We talked about good stuff. Javonte Williams, he's not starting on PUP. Tim Patrick, no PUP. But we kind of got a little bit of bad news there with Baron Browning and also some other key players. Let's start off by talking a little bit about Mike Purcell, who's probably been the most instrumental player among this group of guys. He's obviously not a full-time starter, but he's been a starter. He plays quite a bit, and he played pretty well last year. He's going to be starting this training camp, Cody, on the non-football injury list. So we won't see number 98 out there right away.
Well, I think when we talk about Mike Purcell too, because obviously this week here at our training camp position previews wrapping up, we're going to focus on interior defensive line. And I think Mike Purcell probably is one of the more under the radar Broncos that really doesn't, I think, get as much recognition as probably he deserves from how tough he is, how consistent he is against the run. He's never really been a guy that's going to be an interior pass rush threat, but he has had moments where he has flustered the quarterback inside the pocket. But man, he is a plug, a run stopping plug. You know, whether it's the A gap, the B gap, he's always been one of those guys. But throughout his tenure in Denver, he has dealt with some injuries. He had the broken thumb a couple years ago. He had the Liz Frank injury, which was really probably one of the bigger injuries he sustained. And there was at one point in the offseason a few years ago, he had the hardware removed from his foot that impacted his ability to be ready for the start of camp. Like we mentioned in segment 1, we don't know what the procedure was here on Purcell, though he was in attendance. I think that's big because you look at a guy like Sean Payton, Sayre, I think he values having experienced guys like Mike Purcell. I mean, if you look at Purcell's journey through, you know, being in the NFL initially, being on practice squads, going to the AAF and really kind of making a bigger name for himself, which led to him coming back and getting in the NFL with Vic Fangio and the Denver Broncos. And suddenly Purcell emerged in one of their top defensive linemen, got the contract extension. He was also a guy that kind of took one for the team last year during roster cuts because he's a vested veteran. They were able to cut him and he didn't have to go through the waiver process. They brought him right back. And I think that Denver values his loyalty. And obviously he's been one of the tougher guys and one of the biggest outspoken guys. Like when things aren't going right, he isn't going to say anything that's going to be detrimental to your locker room, but he's going to say like, hey, this is unacceptable. We need to get it going. And I think fans have a lot of respect for him. Obviously for him, we don't know the timeline, but with the defensive line room looking the way that it is, Purcell not being ready for the start of camp definitely makes things a little bit interesting when we preview the position here in a couple of days. But on top of that, as you mentioned, he can come off of it at any time. So it might not be something to sweat at all. There's him, but there's also KJ Hamler, who suffered the partially torn pectoral muscle during the offseason while training. And then he had it surgically repaired. The team announced it. And the expectation is that he's still going to be ready for the start of training camp. It may not be day one, but Sayre, I also remember last year, KJ was on, if I'm not mistaken, it was either the PUP or the NFI list, and he was activated shortly, and he was able to come back and do stuff. He was a limited participant in OTAs and mandatory minicamp. So to me, the fact that he was doing those things, Sayre, it gives me, I think, a little bit more reassurance. I think he'll be fine for training camp. It's just a matter of when. I think that's the bigger question here.
Exactly. And you want to make sure, like I said before, you just want to make sure you're playing all the cards that you have. You don't want to just be sitting there. It's kind of like you have timeouts that you can use before the half. You don't just want to sit there and sit on it. You can,
Or before the end of a game.
Or before the end of a game. Exactly. They're not going to come with you to the second half or to the next game. So as Loki the cat knows, and as obviously we know, Cody, you have to be able to play these cards exactly right. So it's just protecting yourself. It's protecting the player. It's giving yourself an opportunity at flexibility. And of course, we know KJ Hamler, the expectation is that even after the pectoral injury and the surgery to repair that, he was not going to be missing, any real time. And now he's going on the NFI. So everybody, of course, the red flags go up because it's KJ Hamler's name attached to some injury list. Well, it sounds like it should be okay. And you just, again, this is a player that you want to make sure you ease back in, especially an injury like a pectoral injury. You're going out there and you're playing now at more full speed than you are even at OTAs. You've really got to be just 100% ready to go. You don't want to aggravate that in training camp. And to me, I think the Broncos, what they did with his contract, making sure that they're protected in the event of injury, I think they want to keep him and Marvin Mims on this roster. I think they want to have that double speed threat option at that position group. So wouldn't surprise me at all, Cody, if they're just trying to make sure they play it slow with him. But what about Kendall Hinton? He's starting off on the PUP. This is a bit of a surprise because I didn't hear much about him being injured at all over the course of OTAs.
Yeah, and that wasn't what we saw. I mean, there were a couple of days we saw him where he didn't have a helmet on, but he had obviously the jersey and the shorts. So we didn't think it was anything outside of maintenance because Kendall was a guy that needed a little bit of maintenance last year. He was battling through some injuries, but he had a minor, as we found out during, I think, Jerry Judy's youth camp that he threw on here locally. We found out that he had a minor scope procedure. Not sure what that looks like because people say minor scope, but hey, a minor scope is either cleaning or shaving or stapling the meniscus together. And that takes time, something similar to what Baron Browning had done. So it's no secret that both those guys who had those knee procedures on the PUP list. So it's going to take a little bit more time than expected for them, which kind of tells me like, okay, does Kendall Hinton have a bigger role in this offense or is a key backup depth option in the eyes of Sean Payton? If he is going on PUP, it's really hard to tell considering all the depth that there is right now at that position. And I'm glad that you made the point about also KJ Hamler playing it safe because a pectoral injury, we know KJ is a very, very good blocker. We've seen that. He's gotten nitty gritty. He's gotten his nose dirty there, grabbing on. And if you grab and some guy goes another direction, that impacts your pectoral muscle. You have to make sure things are stable. And I imagine when he does come off the list, same thing with Kendall Hinton, there's going to be a lot of testing for these guys. And look, folks, I want to say this. If you're attending practice and these guys come back, it may take some time for them to get to where they want to be because the acclimation period is obviously very important coming off of an injury. The team is going to be very safe with how they approach it. But obviously we now know that everybody who rounds out the NFI list, it's going to be KJ Hamler, Mike Purcell, the PUP list, Baron Browning, and also Kendall Hinton at this point. But that also opens up some more good news here for the Broncos in terms of some other players who are coming off of injuries from last season. We'll dive deep into that on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. You make Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day on your favorite podcasting platform provider, wherever you get your podcasts. And also, if you watch us on YouTube for your second listen of the day, make sure you go check out the Locked On NFL podcast on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. NFL training camp for some teams has officially started, the Chiefs being one of them. Chris Jones has not reported. What do the local experts on the biggest stories have to say about training camp? Aaron Rodgers mania taking over as well. Check out Locked On NFL today, free wherever you get your podcasts, are available on YouTube. As we get ready to round out some of the news coming out from the Denver Broncos on Sunday pertaining to the injury side of things, we've highlighted some injury news that is good for the Broncos with Tim Patrick and Javonte Williams appearing set to go for Friday's training camp kickoff, while other players go on the NFI list or the PUP list. There are some other players, though, that aren't necessarily considered starters or key role players just yet that are creeping their way up the list that could have an impact this upcoming season. And we'll dive deep into those injury statuses. So, Sayre, let's start things off. I think obviously probably with one that Broncos country is very curious about, and that is 6th round rookie draft pick J.L. Skinner. As we know, in the offseason, he obviously missed the NFL scouting combine, was not able to test in some areas due to tearing his pectoral muscle. He had surgery. He was at Broncos rookie minicamp and was performing, but didn't participate much during OTAs or mandatory minicamp. He avoids going on the PUP list, which makes the safety competition, which we've already done an episode on for all you everydayers out there. I think this is a very interesting dynamic. JL Skinner avoids the PUP list, which is a great sign for him, as there is competition between he and Delarrin Turner-Yell at training camp.
Yeah, we're gonna find out, about all these people who said he could be a top 100 player in this year's rookie class and only fell due to that injury. We're about to find out if that's true, right? Because that he's a unique breed at the position, a 6'4" safety who can fly to the line of scrimmage and make a lot of plays. He's a hard hitting guy. I wouldn't say he's necessarily one dimensional either, Cody. He's not just a guy he's not just a heat seeking missile out there who can only come up to the line and hit. I think he can do a little bit of everything for you. And he's kind of one of those chess piece type players on the defensive side who he just happens to have really great size, athleticism for that position. So I'm excited to see JL Skinner. I think a lot of Broncos country is as well. And of course, with most people kind of assuming that he would miss some time in training camp, maybe even beyond, it's really, really positive that he's going to be able to be out there competing right away. I think we're going to see a ton of JL Skinner in the preseason. I really do. Him and, I mean, you said it, DTY, Delarrin Turner-Yell, those two guys are going to be competing maybe for one roster spot. I think they're going to be out there on the field together quite a bit in the preseason. So it's going to be one of those guys that I think the second, third defense is out there. You're watching for JL Skinner to see where is he aligned? What are his responsibilities on a given play? Is he flashing out there? Is he making plays on the ball? Is he coming up in run support? He's going to be one of those players in focus for everybody watching training camp. And I think certainly deservedly so. He's an exciting young rookie.
Well, look for that 6'4" heat-seeking missile at Broncos camp, and we're going to see him in the preseason as well. That's good news for everybody in Broncos country. Some other players, though, that are not going on the PUP list or the NFI list in terms of maybe a little bit of a role player capacity. We talk about ACLs. Aaron Patrick, as we all know, suffered that torn ACL in a freak accident at SoFi Stadium, stepping on the pads. We all know that there was a lawsuit, on his behalf against the NFL, against the Chargers for what had happened there. But man, he has made tremendous progress. I had a chance to see him up close and personal at Broncos minicamp and OTAs. Like, man, he's doing good. Like, he's out there, and obviously during team stuff, he has a brace on. During individual stuff, didn't see him with a brace on. But at Justin Simmons' camp and Kareem Jackson's camp, God, this guy without pads is massive, Sayre. And look, we talk about Barron going on the PUP list. This creates an opportunity as well for Aaron Patrick to really come in and impress a new coaching staff with what he can do, not only on special teams, but the defensive side of the ball. I think it's important that we highlight him. What are your thoughts, too, really on this one coming forth down here for Aaron Patrick? Because I think Denver needs guys that can play not only just special teams and become quality players there in a department of the field that drastically needs it. And, hey, look, speaking of special teams as well, the Broncos over the weekend, they did sign former kicker for the Cowboys, Brett Maher, to a one-year deal. So there will be a kicker training camp competition as well. We could dive deeper into that, but really your thoughts on Aaron Patrick. Then we can really kind of round out the show here talking about the kicking game.
Yeah, I love it. And these two guys, like you said, Maher and Aaron Patrick, they can both impact the kicking game in different ways. Aaron Patrick, obviously an exceptional athlete, great size, as you mentioned, but he's one of those players that as you watch last preseason, he was kind of flashing as the preseason went along off the edge as a pass rusher. He's got tons of traits out there, right? The Broncos stole him off the Jaguars practice squad a couple of years ago, and they've had him developing in the system, and they've had him developing off the edge, getting physically ready to contribute there as a rotational player. And you hit the nail on the head, Cody. I was going to say this Baron Browning going on PUP, it opens up the door for a guy like Aaron Patrick to impress the coaching staff. Now they're going to get to see him more in practices playing with maybe the second or third unit, whereas before he might not be rotating in with that high. He might not be rotating in as high as the second unit, right? So now there's a chance that we could see that. And when they see him rotating in there, when they see what he can do against the number 2 offense, or maybe even if you go ones versus twos, now you're going to get a chance to see what this guy can do against your best players. And that just helps him dramatically in his chances of making the roster. So I am hugely excited about Aaron Patrick, maybe even a little bit irrationally so. And I'm also a little bit irrationally excited about the Brett Maher signing as well, Cody. I was very, very surprised the Broncos didn't sign him initially. Not super surprised that nobody else picked him up in the interim, but certainly excited to have him part of this kicking competition. He was very, very good last year for the Cowboys, made over 90% of his kicks, just had that rough stretch in the playoffs there that obviously everybody remembers. So I think kickers are like pitchers in baseball. A lot of times they go through cold streaks, and they land on another team, and then all of a sudden they're back to being red hot again.
Doesn't he have as well, if I'm not mistaken, I think he has in the last few years the most 60-yard field goals that is made,
Yeah.
which is, we were talking about when Elliott Fry was signed by the Broncos, not a lot of regular season experience, no kicks in his career of 50+ yards. And I think that was a big question for all of us is, Denver needs a guy who can boot that long. So there will be a competition. And obviously for Maher, he went 29 of 32 in the regular season last year for the Dallas Cowboys. He's appeared in 54 games, 3 years with the Cowboys, 1 year with Sean Payton and the New Orleans Saints. So they know what they're getting. He's already been in for a workout. They also brought in during OTAs, a mandatory minicamp, Randy Bullock. Nothing really equated with that. They didn't make any signings. And so now kicking competition and Dove Valley during the training camp. I'm excited about that. Not only just from the standpoint that I think it's good, it'll elevate a guy like Elliott Fry, but also will push a guy like Brett Maher. And you go back to the point, I think everybody in the NFL world, including Broncos fans, they're not going to look at him going 29 of 32. And really from 50+ yards, he was 9 of 11 last year, which is really damn good efficiency. I think his longest was a 61-yarder that he made as well for the Cowboys. That was not at altitude. That was just on a neutral playing field. So there is a benefit to that. But everyone's going to talk about the 1 of 6 on extra points. To me, sir, I always go back to that. And I look at it from a performance standpoint. That's something that I have a master's degree in sports psychology and player performance. That was a clear example of him having the yips just completely in his head. And look, it didn't help that Jerry Jones marched down onto the field pre-game, one game while he was kicking and got in his head even more. Not making an excuse for it. Obviously, you have to perform. But I think what we saw from him in the playoffs was a mental lapse, was the yips. Can he put that behind him? I'm excited to see that here for the Broncos. And look, he was 50 of 53 from extra points and throughout the entire NFL regular season last year. Obviously, you would like to go perfect in that department, but as we know, things happen. I think this is a good move for Denver overall going into training camp. And one thing we want to ask everybody here in Broncos country, do you like the move of the Broncos adding yet another kicker to the mix here for a training camp kicker competition that could lead all the way throughout the entire preseason? Let us know your thoughts on the injury updates that we've provided on today's episode, Locked on Broncos. For all you everydayers out there, here's what you can get on Monday's special episode, Locked on Broncos. We preview the offensive tackle position in our training camp position preview. Do they have good enough depth behind starters? We ask that question and much more, and you'll get that on tomorrow's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.